Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. I'm sorry for not posting lately. I've been to state and districts and also prepping for nationals along with AP testing and finals. I'm sure you guys can relate to that. But after nationals concludes, I'll try to post more and I'll also get back on top of the video request you guys sent me. So in today's lecture, we're going to go over a light overview over the Nationals Lincoln Douglas resolution for 2022, and the resolution is resolved. Radicalism is preferable to incrementalism to achieve social justice. This video won't be too long because frankly I didn't put that much effort into it, but hopefully it'll help everyone out a little bit. So in this video, we'll be going over the general concept and the first glance thoughts on the resolution, and then be going a little more into depth with the definitions along with highlighting over general framework and philosophy that can be ran. And additionally, I'll provide two general pros and cons to either side of the debate, along with some tips for nationals. Just as a preface, I won't be going that far into depth in this video over the resolution because I, like many of you maybe, will be competing at nationals, and so I don't want to disclose anything and everything yet. But I'll try to get everyone started, and maybe you guys can see a different point of view as well. So first, let's look at the general concepts of the resolution. Resolved. Radicalism is preferable to incrementalism to achieve social justice. So when I read the resolution, the first thing that I can see is that both, this is in progressive and traditional LDR's favor. I feel like it more leans towards the traditional standpoint due to the resolution specifically mentioning social justice, which also narrows the frameworks down and available. But on the other hand, we can see that the term preferable also makes it where the resolution can also be more policy orientated, along with involvement and links you can tie that to social justice. We can also see that this resolution is largely tied to the desirability of the status quo. So for instance, if the status quo is bad, then people are going to want to change it. So even if that risks getting worse, they're just going to want to change it. So there are a lot of open interpretations of what it means for radicalism to be preferable to incrementalism. I could say that preferability is a linkage between the betterment of society in the present, while someone could say it's the betterment of society in the future. And there's a ton of other subjective views on what preferability could be. It's completely subjective, but I feel like most of it is up for the interpretation of the judges. Most of it is from a cost-benefit analysis, which would be in turn a good criterion to view from. We can also see that due to the resolution having two definite sides, then people can also incorporate case refutations in their constructive. So this would be being the affirmative and saying that radicalism helps solve ... And we can see historical examples in which incrementalism has not solved ... or so on. So let's go ahead and look at the terms. I would like to define what social justice is first because it's the key element in a thing in which you're going to try to achieve. And if there's controversy on how to define certain terms, then social justice will be the hedge in which you can support your own terms. And it'll also draw the linkage between your standard of frameworks you may be running. So social justice is basically the distribution of wealth and opportunities in a society. And from that right there, we can see a strong linkage to your framework for any value that aligns with equality, or you can even run social justice and make it an unrefutable value because that is the thing we're trying to achieve in the round after all. You can also really stretch what you consider to be social justice, or you can draw a linkage between multiple aspects that will steer the debate right into your favor. Now, with the definition of social justice in mind, then that brings us to our definition of radicalism. So radicalism is the employment of change that occurs relatively fast, via large changes within the adjustment of the status quo, and some probably see it as changing the status quo as a whole. Basically, if you have a bad policy, radicalism would be making it where we just make an entire new policy and throw that one out. That would be a very abstract view of it. So the two pros with radicalism is that it's in sync with society and the urgency matters. So with it being in sync with society, radicalism allows for societal justice to be in sync with the people. This is because there are large changes that need to be implemented and that can lead to a progression and more representation in the status quo. But that also leads us to our disadvantage of rationalization of atrocities, because sometimes these activist endeavors create a kind of moral blindness when you see the world as to a simplistic black and white, and you can't see or respect the complexity of today's problems. Sometimes dedication to a cause results in activists rationalizing some atrocious behavior. Sometimes activists chase the win that they can't see or acknowledge the positive success of changes that they have already happened, and they even accept violence behavior. And then even if you say that radicalism is allowing for equality, then you still have to see that the other disadvantage, which is opposition, which I think this is the biggest one. Because although radical change enhances the speed at which social justice is distributed, it still cannot account for the majority's prejudice. So only incrementalism can incorporate a policy into individuals' day-to-day lives that will lead to acceptance rather than opposition. Because if you really slowly influence a policy into people's lives, like an equality policy, then they're more likely to accept it because that's essentially either what they grow up with or you're slowly brainwashing them essentially. So that's why incrementalism could be better than radicalism, is because it makes it where the people are more accepting of a policy, because radicalism is a radical change and people aren't typically accepting of complete radical change. So this may be an extreme example, and forgive me for this example, but slavery would be an example. So slavery, at first, most people probably didn't accept it, and they definitely didn't historically. But we can see through like an incremental process that gradually people grew up in that acceptance and they further accepted it in the status quo, which is essentially saying what incremental change can do. And you can also, of course, bring up that example, like historical examples in which radicalism has failed. And you can also bring where incrementalism has failed as well, and where like incrementalism would be better and radicalism would be better, and so on and so forth. And then personally, the best approach to radicalism is the urgency, because some problems are more urgent than others. Take vaccinations, for example, or equality policies. Incrementalist policies would make it where the distribution process would take forever. But rather, we can see that the radicalist approach is far more beneficial, because I feel like every argument on the affirmative may branch from the urgency of matters in some way, or then like back to social justice, so that it's just more mindful of that as the negative. So for a radicalism approach, just to prove urgency, the urgency would be like, so this, depending on how you type, this could be a social justice problem. What we're going to go and do with vaccinations because that's the easiest. So from an incrementalist policy, that would take forever to get vaccinations introduced in society. But from a radicalist policy, we can see that they introduced patent pledges, which made it where other countries and other places could make vaccines essentially without like taking the patent. And it was just like, it's a medical excuse so they could patent pledge it essentially. So into incrementalism. Incrementalism is a process that adjusts the status quo via minor changes, which is just like a policy by policy or state by state basis. Incrementalism, obviously, due to this definition, is in direct opposition to radicalism in their function, and so the stances of both sides should be easy to terminate, unlike like the free press topic with the prioritize argument. So incrementalism allows for government to reduce the risk and focus on something to improve the system that is already in place, rather than like starting from scratch and creating a new one. And so the pros are data collection and adjustment. So incrementalism allows for more data collection, and since incremental change is something that is employed over time, then the direct end of a policy can be adjusted as they applied. So, for example, if we make a policy to get rid of tables, radicalism will apply burning all the tables, while incrementalism will allow us to do it one at a time. This would allow for problems to be solved before they are created. For instance, in our example of the tables, this would, in a radicalist society, this would result in enhancement of emissions, in which radicalism would be unable to stop for an instance. But incrementalism would find an alternative to the policies, just as cutting the tables. So another example of this would be making it where radicalism would employ some sort of social change that not all people are aligned with, because people have different conceptions of what is social justice. And if there are different conceptions of what social justice is, then like I said before, there would be opposition to that. So incrementalism would be the best policy in order to get the most data collection for social justice, see if it actually works out with society norms, and if not, then you can slowly introduce it to society. And additionally, incrementalism also gives the people more time to adjust, which can lead to more acceptance, as I said before. Although not all like radical change is bad, we must also see that incremental change is also not that bad after all. Adaptation is the key to public acceptance. Take the example of like a subjugated minority incorporation into the combined school system. These groups within instances of radicalism, although based on good intent, led to violence, while an incrementalist approach as a gradual approach that led to societal acceptance. I believe that most negative stance on this topic will be more on attacking radicalism rather than defending incrementalism, although that is an important change. And then I'll go ahead and give like a tip really quick since it just came to my head, but you're not defending, like, you're not saying that radicalism or incrementalism is completely perfect. You're just saying that you have to show how it's preferable to radicalism or incrementalism. You're not trying to prove that one of the policies is perfect because they're obviously going to have a disadvantage. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. So the biggest disadvantage of incrementalism is how it takes longer. There may be a need for a radical change, then incremental policies aren't as effective. Take once again the instance of the introduction of co-vaccination. A policy which was radical but justified change was to allow for patent pledges on the vaccine, which allowed for companies to copy the vaccine for a better distribution. Now, of course, there were so many other examples, but honestly, I don't want to spoil it, and I'll be competing too, so I don't want to help you guys out too much, no offense, or disclose any information. So, another disadvantage is falsified hope, because incremental change can create a sense of falsified hope due to there being hardly any change in the status quo. And then, now that I thought of it, another pro of incrementalism would be how it's more of like aligned with democratic acceptance. So, like in democracies, we obviously have an incremental cycle of introducing policies where we can see a radical policy won't be as accepted more and it won't have as much like detail or anything. So take like the capital, for instance. So the House of Representatives and the Senate both have like a co-author of a certain bill when they introduce a bill, and they introduce it to one or the other side. And when they introduce it, they have questions over it and debate over it, and if it is rejected, then they give it back to the House or back to the Senate, and the authors revise it, or so on and so forth, if they want to. And if it gets accepted, then that'll be sent to the opposite side of the Capitol, which would be either to the Senate, or from the Senate to the House of Representatives, or from the House of Representatives to the Senate. And then after it's sent to either side of those, then that would make it where, once again, they are voted on once again, they have a debate, and then they have a combined session at the end of, like, I guess it would be like a term, basically, but at the end of the year or end of, I forgot what period it was, but after that they'd have a combined session in which they both vote over it or both have a debate on it. So we can obviously see how incrementalism is used in today's society and how it's beneficial to society, and you can additionally show how radicalism won't be accepted in society, and thus there won't be as radical changes from a policy standpoint, like a large policy standpoint. So you'd say radicalism is essentially useless because we can't make any big changes, and that's why we should prefer incrementalism because of what it's done in the past. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on. So now on to the affirmative. I feel as though most things will be under the urgency arguments, which is when you show a bad thing that is very urgent and simple that needs to change now, and then you could link that back to social justice. And of course, there's a ton of other affirmative like defenses and contentions and advantages, but I'm not going to go over those because some of them I kind of want to surprise people at nationals that I've thought of. But so I'm sorry for not disclosing that, but I've thought of something like that. So you could also directly attack incrementalism as a whole in the constructive by showing how incrementalism emphasizes gradual change. You could say that the problem with gradual change is that it's not sufficient enough to address this, like how severe the status quo is. Because all around us we can see the current strife and anguish caused by actions and social norms. And this is exactly why we need radical change, is what you could say. Without radical change, then we'd be ignoring these problems in the status quo for longer, and thus perpetuating structural violence among minorities. And rather than asserting this injustice for longer, you'd be essentially saying that we need to address these things immediately and stop these harms being caused by the status quo. About how we can't just stand aside and let these things continue, we need to address them. And of course, you can make more refutations, but I'll leave that to you guys to research. And you can also go back to the slides earlier to find a couple as well, and also an extension on the urgency argument. Now, for the negative, I think you'll be mostly showing the disadvantages of radicalism, especially with the opposition of the status quo mentioned earlier. You could also show how incrementalism is the only thing needed in democratic changes. So, like for instance, as you can refer to the House of Representatives and Senate example, that is a direct point of incremental change, and you could show how radical change will essentially not be accepted if we have it. And that's why incremental change is the best, because it is a large policy and thus it reaches more people in societal change. So everything around us is basically incremental change. So just find out how taking your time is good in a policy. And you can talk about the opposition or political change or political reality, which is what was discussed before, of having incrementalism. And there's, once again, a lot of things with the negative too, but I want to surprise everyone at nationals. So just some tips for nationals. I would say to not do that progressive arguments or case. If you look in the past, we can see that 99% of national competitors that make it really far are those who speak well and are understandable, and also traditional debaters. And additionally, just be sure that all of your arguments are cohesive and make sense. So don't go for that argument that doesn't make like any sense or absolutely no one has thought of. Unless it like actually makes logistical sense, and just like draw a connection to the status quo. I would also advise you not to run case because most of them are looked down upon at nationals. And finally, just like show how incrementalism or radicalism solves the problems presented or directed to the opposing side. I think the ass side will be easier in this topic just because the status quo needs changing and there's so much in their favor. But a good negative can really combat them. So that draws us to the end of the video. Please like, share, and subscribe if you think this video is helpful and educational, and stay tuned for more. Once again, I will not be posting until after nationals, and then I'll start in the video requests that some of you guys have sent me. Also comment below if you guys have any questions or commentary, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.